Hamish de Bretton-Gordon is a retired British Army colonel. He was commanding officer of UK's in NATO chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear reaction troops. Welcome to our program, Colonel Hamish.
Thank you very much for having me.
Vladimir Putin threatens to nuke Ukraine, and all Western countries who have been providing Ukraine with long-range missiles, the United States, France and the United Kingdom. Also today, Putin said that his new hypersonic missile, intercontinental one, the several strikes of this missile would be similar to nuclear strike. What is your reaction to this, and don't you think that we are closer to global nuclear war than ever before?
Well, I think there are a number of things to look at here. Firstly, the nuclear threats coming out of the Kremlin and Putin are nothing new. They've been threatening really since day one, over 1,000 days now. So I think we must be fairly circumspect about that. I don't think anybody believes that Putin is threatening what we call Armageddon, strategic nuclear attack across the world, because that would be completely against everything that he says he's trying to achieve. When it comes to the tactical nuclear threat, if we look at that, I think what has precipitated his vehement exchanges in the last few days and even today is the fact that he knows that now Ukraine has the UK Storm Shadow missile and the American ATACMS missile with the authority to strike into Russia. Actually, it nullifies Putin's tactical nuclear weapons. And in very simple terms, the reason that is Putin's tactical nuclear weapons are either a warhead on an Iskander missile or dropped from a jet like an Su-35. Now, both these tactical nuclear weapons have a range of about 400 miles. Therefore, to strike cities within Ukraine, they'd have to be launched right from the Ukraine, very close to the Ukraine border. Hence, Putin now knows that will be incredibly difficult for him with Storm Shadow and ATACMS. So I still think the threat of nuclear attack should be dismissed by the West, and they shouldn't be fearful of coming into the guise of Putin just because he is going to attack them with tactical nuclear weapons. I think the second point, the hypersonic missiles that you mentioned, that they claim to have fired into Ukraine last week, and I believe even today, Russia has claimed that it will fire this hypersonic missile at command and control bunkers in Kyiv and around Ukraine itself. I think this is an escalation, and I think looking at the massive onslaught of missiles fired at Ukraine, particularly the energy infrastructure over the last few days, the West needs to look very carefully on how it can help or support Ukraine in its air defense. And I personally believe that NATO jets, particularly from the UK and France, should be involved to help support Ukraine here. After all, we have done this to support the Israelis when the Iranians fired missiles and drones on a number of occasions at Israel. Both British and American and French jets shot them out of the sky from international airspace. So I think NATO should seriously consider doing the same. And the final bit on this, a lot of people feared escalation by attacking Iranian missiles fired at Israel. But actually, as we've seen this week, it's precipitated a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, who are an Iranian proxy, and actually Iran is much diminished. So I think we're getting to a stage now where it should be a serious consideration of NATO using its jets to prevent missiles being fired at Ukraine infrastructure and Ukraine civilian targets in the major cities.
Don't you think that it is important to remind Russia of Western ability to retaliate with nuclear weapons in case of Russia's nuclear attack? Because we have been hearing this escalation rhetoric from Kremlin for a while. Even today, Vladimir Putin continues to threaten the West with nuclear attack.
Yeah, I think it's very important to remind Putin of NATO's capabilities and the fact that NATO collectively, with all the NATO countries, including the US, militarily are far more powerful than the Russians. But there has been little sort of kickback from NATO and Western capitals to all these threats of nuclear attack. And I think the West needs to make it clear it's highly unlikely that the West would retaliate with nuclear weapons themselves at this stage. But I think what they would do is an overwhelming conventional response. And with the power of Western air forces and also their conventional capability, I think they could very much destroy the Russian army and air force. And I expect Putin sort of knows that, which is why he keeps threatening to escalate. But I think it would be very important for the morale of the Ukraine people to hear the British Prime Minister and others just reiterating to Putin what a nuclear attack would mean on Ukraine and how it would very much be the end of Putin and the end of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. So, yeah, there is a psychological as well as a physical requirement to just state what an escalation would mean to Russia itself.
There are also discussions on the West about the technical readiness of NATO for even a global nuclear war, because Russia has more than 4,000 nuclear warheads. 1,700 warheads are ready to be used right now. And how do you see this issue? And is the West ready for a nuclear war with Russia at this stage? And another question, is NATO capable of intercepting such intercontinental hypersonic missiles?
Well, I think two very important and very big questions there. I think when it comes to the nuclear parity, as we call it, the mutually assured destruction between Russia and the West, yeah, I think absolutely the West is ready, and there is parity. Russia might well have 4,000 or so nuclear weapons, but then the West has that as well. The US in particular, supported by the French and also the British governments, who are also nuclear capable. So I don't think there is any doubt, and I think Putin is well aware of this, that actually a nuclear exchange between these states would cause mutually assured destruction, and that would be the end of it. And Putin absolutely knows that, and I'm sure there are still discussions in private channels between the various governments to make sure that it doesn't happen. So I don't think that there is any fear of that at all. When it comes to intercepting these intercontinental ballistic missiles, certainly the United States has a very comprehensive capability to do that. Other countries less so. But I would say also that Russia does not have the means to interdict American and British intercontinental ballistic missiles. In fact, probably less. And also a lot of its air defense capability they've used up in the war with Ukraine. So actually, the balance is probably more with the West at the moment, and that is perhaps something that the West should be talking about. That Russia would likely suffer much more quickly than the West in a nuclear exchange. When it comes to the hypersonic missiles that the Russians keep talking about, well, last year, again, there was much vaunted talk about hypersonic missiles fired from Russia, but Ukraine managed to knock most of them out of the sky. And even the latest hypersonic missile, although it did impact into Ukraine last week, there is, I think, if Western forces, and particularly the US, gave its high-level air defense to Ukraine, or made it available, that even these latest super hypersonic weapons, as Putin calls them, would also be knocked down. So I think overall that there is very much parity, if not an advantage to the West in a nuclear strike. And again, it would be well worth Western leaders articulating this. And I think it's a valuable opportunity here for me as a nuclear weapons expert to reassure the people in Ukraine this, and also to make it absolutely clear to anybody who is watching and listening in Russia that actually the Russians are likely to fare much worse in a nuclear exchange than the West.
Also, Vladimir Putin today threatened Ukraine with strikes on decision-making centers. He has been threatening this even after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, but does the strikes make any kind of sense from a military point of view? Do you think such strikes can help Russia to prevail strategically?
Well, I'm not sure they can. Having said that, of course, Ukraine strikes on Russian command and control centers in the Crimea and also in other parts of Ukraine that Russia currently holds have been very effective. And I think strikes into Belgorod and also strikes into Kursk have been very effective at their command and control centers. But Putin, I think, has threatened to strike centers in Kyiv at the moment. I would be very surprised if those strikes were effective. And of course, the Ukraine military and government will have many contingency plans to be able to overcome if that did happen. So I think at the moment this is more sort of rhetoric from Putin, who is getting more desperate. The British Ministry of Defense intelligence update earlier this week detailed that the Russians had lost 700,000 men, casualties, killed and injured thus far in the war. And that is an unsustainable figure. They appear to be losing 2,000 soldiers a day in Kursk, even relying on tens of thousands of North Korean soldiers. They will soon run out. So I think there are a number of things here. Putin is getting increasingly desperate. The world knows that President Trump is going to be the leader of the US from the 20th of January 2025. And there is a lot of talk coming out of the US now that Trump will enforce a ceasefire on Putin. There is also a lot of talk that his new envoy to Ukraine and also his defense ministers are suggesting that they will increase US military support to Ukraine and not decrease it, as some people think will happen with Trump as president. So I think you put all those things together and you can see that Putin is, feels that, he is in a corner. He is a sort of cornered rat and doing anything he can to try and get into a better position by the end of January. And it's absolutely key that that NATO countries, especially those in Europe, make sure that Ukraine is in the best possible position come the end of January, because things are difficult at the moment. I think everybody knows that.
Before we move forward with Donald Trump's policy, future policy on Ukraine, I would like also to ask you for the last time about the nuclear topic. BBC reported about Russian deserter who previously served in Russian nuclear forces. So according to this deserter, Russia's nuclear forces were on full combat alert at the beginning of full-scale invasion. So they were in full combat readiness several weeks after the beginning of full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And my question is why? Has Russia planned to launch nuclear weapons on the West or Ukraine during the first weeks of illegal invasion of Ukraine?
Well, again, I think this is a really interesting story, and I think you can look at it from a whole, different bunches of directions. I think, first of all, strategic nuclear forces are always on high alert. It is well known that the British nuclear capability is in Trident submarines that were full of Trident missiles that are always at sea, always ready to fire. But there is that is no, that's not newsworthy, as it were. The same with the United States and the same with French. Their nuclear forces are always on alert and always ready. So I don't think this is any exception. I think also the other thing to note about this Russian deserter, he was quoted as a high-level commander. I mean, that is not the case. He was a junior officer, and he was involved in what we call force protection. In other words, he was a guard guarding the base where these nuclear weapons are stored. So whether he would have great insight is in question. But again, I think this is just part of the sort of information and propaganda campaign that no doubt Russia wants to wants to inflame, as it were. But I think actually it's a bit of a non-story, because everybody who has a nuclear weapon is always, at the height of readiness. Because if your enemy thinks you won't fire your nuclear weapon, then it's no longer a deterrent. So I think, I'm not surprised. Of course, at a heightened alert time, Putin knew that what he was doing was illegal, and the West would stand up against it. But I would have thought that they were no closer to firing a nuclear weapon on the 24th of February 2022 than perhaps they are today.
Ukraine has struck underground command center in the Kursk region, killing dozens of Russian and North Korean officers, according to the Financial Times publication. Ukraine has used long-range Storm Shadow cruise missiles. Do you expect such strikes to continue? And from your perspective, do you feel that such strategy could force Putin to a negotiating table?
Well, first of all, I absolutely do expect those strikes to continue. Storm Shadow, in particular, is an ideal weapon for doing this sort of thing. It's a double-headed weapon. In other words, it can once it's hit its target, it can then burrow underground and then explode again. So command and control centers that are deep underground are exactly what it's designed to take out. And of course, if you take out the command and control, then the forces in front are unled and become a rabble. So I expect this will continue, as much as possible, because I think whoever holds Kursk come Christmas or the New Year is in a very strong position, and the Russians are putting a lot of effort into trying to retake as much of Kursk as they can, because they think they'll be in a much better position if the Trump ceasefire comes in January. So these things will keep going. There are reports that Britain has given Ukraine more Storm Shadow missiles, and that is good news. So let's hope that they can make a real difference and help Ukraine prevail in this after this illegal invasion from Russia.
Let's cover also recent nomination by Donald Trump in his national security team. So we know about Mike Waltz, who would become U.S. national security advisor. Also Kate Kellogg, former U.S. military commander, lieutenant general, would become special envoy for Russia and Ukraine. And it seems like, according to CNN, they will try to move forward with a ceasefire in Ukraine. On the other hand, Reuters reported that Kremlin would be ready for a ceasefire, but on Russia's terms. Do you expect, what is your take on the possibility of a ceasefire in Ukraine next year?
Well, let's hope that's the case. But as you said, it really depends on whose terms that it is. I think whatever people think about President Trump, and certainly some of his nominations for some of the key posts that you've covered there, actually most of the people who are going to be in these positions are very bullish about support to Ukraine, which I expect has rather caught the Kremlin on the hop, and certainly Putin. I think Putin was relying on President Trump being more favorable to the Russians. But actually, the indications coming out of the Trump campaign and coming out of Washington at the moment would suggest actually that Trump is going to double down on support to Ukraine. And I think that's why, the Russians are really, throwing the kitchen sink, as the expression we use in Britain, at Ukraine at the moment, because it would appear that come the 20th of January 2025, potentially America is going to step up its support to Ukraine militarily, and Putin is going to have to approach a ceasefire with Ukraine in the advantage. So Putin is clever enough to realize that the United States is the fundamental player in this. And if Trump wants to increase support and force Putin's hand, then he probably can. So I think I'm hoping people in Ukraine are feeling slightly more upbeat of a Trump presidency come the end of January next year. And let's hope people in the Kremlin and Putin realize that this could be, a very bad news for him. And so hopefully we will get the ceasefire, as you say, but very much on Ukraine terms, not Russian terms.
From your perspective, what would a ceasefire mean for the outcome of this war in the long-term perspective?
Well, that is absolutely key. A short-term ceasefire, is not going to do anybody any good at all. The ceasefire must be very much to what the Ukraine government wants, and it must secure a long-term peace. It's very clear that President Putin, if he prevails in Ukraine, would not stop there, and I think Western leaders are beginning to understand that now and believe it. But a short-term peace will not do anybody any good. I mean, having said that, it is very clear that the Russian economy is in a terrible state and in free fall. It's been reported all over the world, and actually coming out of Moscow with interest rates going through the roof, the ruble crashing, and whatever Putin thinks, he can't keep fighting with no money. And I think Russian people are suddenly beginning to realize that actually the shops are getting empty. There's not food in the shops. And that's becoming really, really serious. The other thing, of course, is that the Russian army has been absolutely devastated, not only from its material, its tanks and aircraft, but also personnel. So, actually the West can be, I think, quite confident that it can sue for a really good peace and ceasefire that will be lasting, because certainly if NATO flexes its muscles, Putin has no real chance. Now, whether that ceasefire would also include Ukraine becoming part of NATO, maybe not in the short term, but hopefully the long term. But the fundamental piece is that whatever ceasefire and peace is negotiated, it's got to be on Ukraine's terms. Otherwise, it'll be very short lasting and will plunge Europe into war for many, many years, I expect.
How can the West enforce any kind of ceasefire deal between Ukraine and Russia? There are lots of ideas about deploying British troops to a demilitarized zone to enforce a ceasefire. There are other ideas about providing Ukraine with strategic non-nuclear deterrent strategic capabilities that would allow Ukraine to strike back if Russia, for example, tries to attack Ukraine and tries to move out of this ceasefire. deal. Other officials even suggest returning Ukraine its own nuclear capabilities. So what should be a key of enforcing this ceasefire deal and making sure that Russia will not use this deal to regroup, to reinforce, and then attack Ukraine again with even more larger forces and more bigger power?
Well, you're right. I mean, I think absolutely your question is, quite how complex a ceasefire could be. And that's why it's got to be a long-term ceasefire. We know, I think coming out of the US, a suggestion, perhaps even from President Trump, that a buffer zone or demilitarized zone could be patrolled by British troops. I'm not sure that really is the best plan. Certainly a demilitarized zone might well work, and the United Nations, who really have been pretty inept so far in this war, could play a role there with United Nations types troops. But when it comes to the ability to strike back, I think, and I know that President Zelensky has talked in the last few weeks about Ukraine redeveloping its own nuclear weapon capability after Ukraine's nuclear weapons were taken away in 1994 in the Budapest Memorandum, which of course Russia and the US and the UK signed to protect Ukraine, and that clearly hasn't happened. But I expect it will be really at the behest of probably the US and the UK and France to provide that strategic punch to persuade Putin to not re-attack Ukraine after a ceasefire. But I think it's all to be discussed. I think nothing should be taken off the table, and it's we know the sort of the strategist that Putin is. However dreadful and whatever tyrant he is, he seems to be very good at his sort of strategy, and it's important that the West supporting Ukraine is equally as smart in negotiating and supporting this ceasefire. So I think the number one thing is to get a ceasefire on Ukraine's terms, and then to work out how best to enforce that ceasefire, and nothing at this stage should be taken off the table.
And could Tomahawk long-range cruise missiles play a key role in future deterrence of Ukraine in just making sure Russia would not try again to invade Ukraine?
Well, I'm not sure any particular weapon like cruise missile, Tomahawk cruise missiles would do that. I think it is the general might of NATO, which really must flex its muscles, which hitherto has been very slow to advance and support. As we discussed at the very beginning, I think NATO should seriously consider using its fighter jets to knock down Russian missiles and drones fired at Ukrainian civilian targets, as they did Iranian missiles fired at Israel. I think that would be a severe dent to Russia's ability to further prosecute this war in Ukraine. But I think it's up for the West to articulate absolutely to Putin that any breaking of the ceasefire will have a strategic impact on Putin and Russia itself. And you get the feeling that the Russian people, with its economy crashing, are absolutely ready for a ceasefire and the end of this war. And let's hope that their voices are heard loud and clear in Moscow, and Putin takes notice of them.
Thank you, Colonel Hamish, for your time and for supporting Ukraine. Glory to Ukraine.